So, as Stengers argues on page 35 in chapter 3, the promise of evidence-based solutions that are so prized in the 21st century makes thinking otherwise impossible. So, in other words, Stengers is arguing that we're now so accustomed to the intelligibility, reliability, and validity of facts or answers that we've forgotten how to experience complexity. We've forgotten how to ask provocative questions. So we've forgotten how to think beyond authoritative truths. So last week you responded to the question, what becomes impossible when we rely on developmental logics, on facts and evidence as a basis for thought? So here we can see some parallels to Stengers' arguments to that of some of the texts that you've probably already read in this program. For example, Beyond Quality in Early Childhood Education by Dahlberg, Moss, and Pence. Stengers is also highlighting how the sciences produce their own terms of measurement and thus produce their own contexts for reason, as if the living world in motion can be contained and predetermined within spaces and outcomes that are controllable. Yet also, as Dahlberg, Moss, and Pence have argued elsewhere, our tools of evaluation or measurement don't reflect meaning, they create meaning, they produce meaning. So thus, our work has to deeply consider the methods in which we use to make meaning. And borrowing from Jia Law, consider how our methods produce realities. And this is something that Stengers is highlighting. So what she's also proposing is a radical unsettling of the very terms in which we ground our thinking. So the categories that exist already and funnel knowledge into readable terms. And this is maybe why often when we begin reading with Stengers, it can be difficult because she's provoking us to think in terms beyond what we already know. So her writing, I think, very much embodies this ethic, and perhaps she invites us to pay attention to her language. If we notice her language, we can see how she's provoking ideas that are situated in the not yet, the ephemeral, that which is on the brink of existence. And the ways in which she plays with language calls for other frameworks of thought, other ways of making connections and making sense of what it is that she's pointing and gesturing toward. Yet in the midst of her gesture toward questions that make the truth stutter, as she says, Stengers also warns that capitalist rationalities have entrepreneurial ways of benefiting from every situation, especially innovative thought. So in chapter 3, she uses the example of the GMO event that took place in Europe. So the inventiveness of science in the making of GMOs have been presented as a technological solution to solve world hunger, producing and distributing food more efficiently and at rapid rates to provide a solution to social and environmental precarity that again is still based in logics of development, production, and advancement that we discussed last week. So in this chapter, Stengers is arguing that this trust that science can save us from social and ecological effects of colonialism and capitalism actually perpetuates the problems of the 21st century that we're trying to reckon with, the coming barbarisms, as she calls them. So here, there's no change in thinking. The natures of thought continue to be situated within the progressive-driven, accumulative logics that created these conditions of precarity in the first place. So what I wonder is, where does this assurance and trust in science come from? What does it do, and what might it pacify? Stengers also highlights the ways in which scientific knowledges are intimately entangled with economic productivity, where the sciences are supposedly at the service of everyone, yet patents and relentless innovation profits some and leaves others at the risk of its effects. Though often imagined as existing in neutral spaces outside of the political sphere, research, Stengers argues, is not a neutral act. What research gets funded, the methodologies used, and who enacts it, who takes up these research projects, are all informed by epistemological values that fluctuate within economic and political discourses. So what becomes researched and how is predicated on what matters to certain people and who are able to exercise power in determining what knowledge becomes produced. And this is what Stengers calls the knowledge economy. For Stengers, this GMO conflict that took place in Europe was very much an opportunity, a time when public opinion drew attention to the instability of scientific reason and a mistrust of its reach. So there was a dissensus about the use of GMOs in Europe that provoked public question and provoked a response, a public response. And here I want you to highlight and hold on to this language that she uses of response that she uses in this chapter. So I want you to think about what are the differences between a solution and a response? What does this change in language do? And what's different here? What kind of orientation does response invite over solution? And what do these two words put into motion? So Stengers refers to this GMO conflict as an event. So let's also pay attention to this choice of wording, of event. On page 39, she writes, quote, "What is proper to every event is that it brings the future that will inherit from it into communication with a past narrated differently." So for me, this sentence screams pedagogy. It makes me think about what an event does to thinking, how pedagogy might become eventful in that it brings into fruition a future that inherits the past in ways that compose this past in other ways. So in our work with children, what kinds of exposures, encounters, conflicts, provocations, and events might be put into motion if we are to respond, as Stengers says, to a fraught past and in a future that doesn't shy away from the contradictions and complexities of the worlds we're both inheriting and creating. So in chapter 3, Stengers highlights some of the things that were generated from this GMO event, one of which was the fact that it highlights the fact that people can become capable of asking difficult questions. So she says that these public questions, which trouble the smoothness of taken for granted assumptions, belong to, quote, "a political struggle to invent the manner in which to make what has thus been learned count," end quote, to reconfigure what matters and what counts as meaningful, and bringing into politics that which was supposed to transcend it. So putting the neutrality of scientific truth into question and bringing this truth into a political arena and into public dialogue.